Okay, well, welcome everybody. We are going to look at law today. We're going to compare the various worldview perspectives on law. I'm going to do a PowerPoint, and then Professor William Wagner is going to share for an hour. And we're going to have a great time looking at law. But I'm going to just go through, first of all, just some general background about law before we get to the actual issues. We need to see what we're dealing with, this thing called law. So let's look at this right now. Okay, it's not going to let me advance. Wait a second. Okay, we got a problem. It's not letting me advance this. Okay, let's start. The word laws comes from lagu, which means code or rules. It's the study of principles of conduct or procedures which are expected to be observed. We need to start thinking about basic questions like, what is the purpose of law? And of course, we'll get into this once we answer the various worldview perspectives, but here's just some background questions to stir our thinking. How should justice, which is a major issue in law, how should it be defined? I remember taking a course at university when I was doing my graduate studies on, the course was a philosophy course on justice, theories of justice, and it was quite complicated as people struggled to figure out what the word actually means. Because the whole world has different worldviews, they of course would define the word justice differently. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, the word good, what's good? And that often has a lot to do with law, because we're going to be dealing with morality, which is the basis of law. Law is an encoded morality. What kind of laws should society have? And how should society be structured? So these are some of the questions that we have to address when we start thinking about law. I want to look at the origin of law. What are some possible bases for it? Well, one, called legal positivism or positive law, is a base that laws are created and defined by humans or human institutions. And it could be the courts, or it could be legislators. But which one? Which group of humans are authorized to create law? Is it a social contract that we all entered into as humans? I don't remember making that contract. Is it the will of the leader or the king? And this is a very important historical point to stop for a minute. Our system, or our civilization, has benefited greatly from Samuel Rutherford, who wrote a book published in 1644 AD called Lex Rex. And a lot of people don't understand what this actually did to create a very real biblical foundation for law that many other countries in the world, including the Marxist world, the Islamic world, many nations run by tyrants, don't operate. And so it's very hard for them to create a functioning democracy, because the king is above the law. They have a situation called Rex Lex, which Samuel Rutherford addressed back in his day. And that means the will of the king was the law. Whatever the king wanted, that was the law. Rex, the king, is the law. So if he wanted you beheaded, you were beheaded. If he wanted to take your wife, he took your wife. I mean, the king was the law. And Rutherford wrote his book, Lex Rex, to show that really, for justice to occur, the law must be above the king. The king himself must be subject to the law. And the government in our Western nations are accountable to the law. And this is very important because as Christians, we know we are accountable to the laws of God ultimately, and all humans are accountable to his law. So Lex Rex is a very significant issue in having just and functioning Western democracies, because it means everyone is able to be judged by the law. The question is, where does that law come from? Which law? Whose law? But this is a very important thing to remember. And that's why it's so hard for, say, George Bush, when he tried to set up a democracy in Iraq. They weren't about to accept Lex Rex, a separate law being king, because where would it come from? So they instituted 100% Islamic Sharia as their source. So you can't just transplant a Western democracy into an Islamic state and expect it to function, or into Africa, if they don't really recognize and accept the importance of the process brought about by Lex Rex. Anyway, that's something for more study. So positive law, well, shall we just use reason? Maybe we can create laws not just with a social contract, or maybe the reason is enough. Or maybe we need a consensus. Let's see, who should we ask to decide what laws we have, and why should that matter? Another possible base is natural law, law based upon an internal code of morality supposedly possessed by all people. And of course, the Bible does say that we all have a moral conscience that God put there. So we do agree with natural law. It comes out of the nature of man and the universe that God made. Another possible basis is God, who has created the universe according to his nature. He rules. Divine law are his principles upon which he rules the universe. They're based on his character and nature. They are absolutes, and creation reflects that. Our very nature reflects the idea that we already know that there are moral truths. We violate them and have conscience guilt. So all humans recognize moral obligation, and that really does come from God. Okay, what's the purpose of law then? Question number 2. Is it to protect the individual from the state? Is it to maintain the freedom of the individual? Is it to promote the interests of those in society? Is it to promote the good of society? And again, we have to be careful, because not everybody defines good in the same way. We all have different worldviews. What a Muslim defines as good and just is not really what a Christian would in terms of politics, that's for sure. Is law's purpose to please God and love our neighbor? So these are important questions as we wrestle with the power of the state, the rights of individuals, and what God expects of us here on earth. And you know, many Christians don't even venture into the area of law to consider what God may be asking of us here on earth in terms of creating just societies. They think of only salvation rather than demonstrating justice on earth. Another issue in law is the definition of the good. Who defines the good of society? Somebody said, this is a great benefit for your country, or this will be good for all people. Where do you get your definition, considering the very different reference points different worldviews have? People say we want a better society. Well, define better. And law has a lot to do with this, because remember, law is a moral code implemented. So your laws will reflect the moral basis of your nation. So when people say they want a better society, you should say, well, you need to define what that is. And many Christians can't even articulate this, which is a shame. How should we define progress? You know, you hear politicians say, we want to progress, we want, want to develop. Again, these words have different meanings in different worldviews. Utilitarianism has been suggested as a basis for law. It aims to maximize the good in society, whatever that means. But what is the greatest good for the greatest number? So herein we end up in philosophical and theological issues like abortion. Like people say, well, abortion's good and people have a right to an abortion because, well, the world's overpopulated, or unwanted children would suffer. So it's better that we terminate them. It's better for them, So the greatest good is abortion because we're overpopulated, or euthanasia. We need euthanasia because, after all, we're running out of resources and there's too many old people like us. So utilitarianism is a dangerous philosophy because it is the means, the end justifying the means. So you want less people, so it's quite good to have abortion. So you can promote a lot of evil with a utilitarian view. Well, what about the individuals in a utilitarian view? All right, another basis is individualism. It emphasizes the individual and his freedom as the highest value. So what do we mean by freedom? And these are philosophical issues, again, to define terms like justice, like good, like progress, and freedom. We can't have absolute freedom. We're not absolutely free. We're accountable to God. So Christians do not advocate anarchy or absolute freedom. So where does law come into this? How much freedom do we surrender to produce a biblical society? Another issue in law is rights. What are the origin of rights? We hear a lot of talk today that I have a right to this, and human rights and group rights and social rights, and yet I challenge anybody to come up with a basis for this outside of God. So a good friend of mine a few years ago wrote his PhD on rights and where they come from. And, he was able to destroy every foundation put forward as a basis for rights, including the state, the courts, this group of humans, that culture, that ethnic group. The point is, rights can be manufactured out of thin air by humans, by governments, by courts, just on the whim of humans. But what is their basis? And we see as Christians, we really don't have a lot of rights. We have the right to life implied by God because he owns us. But we got to be very careful with simply claiming rights to this and rights to that, because if you have a right to an unobstructed view of the mountains, that means your neighbor who wants to build a second story is obligated not to build. So rights imply duties to others. So claiming rights to this or to that, like our governments are doing nowadays, is causing huge obligations upon others to respect and fulfill their rights. So it's a dangerous concept, and we have to tread very carefully. And we have to challenge people's claim that they have rights to this and right to that. Do people have a right to a happy life? Who's going to provide it? Do people have a right to a fulfilling job? Well, who's obligated to provide that? Is the state obligated? Do you have a right to be well fed? So should the state provide that? I mean, rights imply obligations. And what are they? Except a claim that somebody has or a group has. It's a claim against somebody else. I have a right to silence, so you have an obligation not to speak. I mean, you can create a right to all sorts of things. And we've got to be careful, because law is entwined with this notion of rights, and it fights for rights, and it implies rights, like the right to an abortion. I mean, where did that come from? How did that judge in 1973, Roe versus Wade, determine that people had a right to kill their unborn babies? So these are dangerous things if we don't wrestle with the definitions. and who creates them? As I mentioned, what do we ask the court to do it? Why should we trust the court? Any court? Whose court? A Marxist government court or an Islamic Sharia court? And if rights can be created, can they be taken away? And who's going to decide that? So we no longer have a right during this COVID-19, plandemic, not pandemic. We no longer have a right to go out in a park in a group of 3 or 4. We're losing the right to go to church because the state has declared that you will not go to church in a group because of this, pandemic. So your right to go to church has been taken away, even temporarily, but who knows, it might be permanent. So who's going to decide who gives and takes rights? We got to also wrestle with these terms, justice and mercy, which address law. We need to think of what does it mean to be guilty of something? What is innocence? And again, all these terms need to be, discussed theologically and philosophically because they're defined differently by different worldviews. An Islamic view of guilt, religious guilt, could get you killed, beheaded in Saudi Arabia simply for becoming a Christian. So you'll be put to death in Pakistan if you say something negative about the Quran. So you're not innocent, you're guilty. So freedom of speech is curtailed when everybody starts defining crimes differently. And so we need to see the power of worldviews in shaping law. We need to know there's a difference between sin and moral weakness, and this has to be demonstrated in law. Is the goal of law to punish or to rehabilitate? So this is a big, big debate question. And is there rehabilitation in heaven? Is there a halfway house that you get rehabilitated, a purgatory before heaven, where you can sort of fix things up? Or is there just final judgment? It is. So are jails to rehabilitate or to punish? And this is a big one. So let's look at some of these laws, the worldviews, very, very briefly. And again, we're going to have a Professor Wagner is going to probably cover aspects of this. I'm not going to, but let's look at the secular humanist law. We have to understand that morality and therefore law to the secular humanists is constructed by humans, simply humans, and it's subject to change because of that. Secular humanists don't believe in God, so they have no reference point for morality. So they have no real reference point for law, especially if they believe in evolution, because law itself has to evolve, according to evolutionists. So law would be changing all the time. And for the secular humanists, law must serve our interests and be flexible to our times and perspectives. And this leads to a lot of judicial activism, where people are defining human needs and interests and then constructing rights to protect those interests, like the porn industry or marijuana being legalized in states and provinces in Canada. So people want to protect their interests and they declare those as justice. And the next thing you know, you have a law that controls your behavior. So a lot of judicial activism as interests of various groups are lobbied for. There's also the denial of natural rights, inherent rights, because after all, if we're just evolutionary products, we're just descended from apes, then how could we have any inherent natural rights? In Canada, we need to realize, first of all, that Canada was not founded as a secular state, secular government. Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God. It's in our Constitution as well. In fact, the national anthem, O Canada, has a line in it, God, keep our land glorious and free. So these Judeo-Western influenced countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, America, etc., largely started and built their constitutions on the idea there's a God and we're accountable. The purpose of the Charter of Rights in Canada is to protect rights and freedoms of the people against the government. And this is important, that individual freedom needs to be protected from government overreach. But what about now? Well, it's become a bit of relativism. The Canadian Supreme Court's view now is this: our Constitution is a living tree, which by way of progressive interpretation accommodates and addresses the realities of modern life. That is your secular humanist view today, that law will simply be bent here and there, depending on who's on the bench, depending on who's in government, to address the realities of modern life. This can be seen today in postmodernism too. A Canadian Supreme Court judge suggested the curriculum for kindergarten children in Surrey, near here, wasn't complete without portrayals of non-traditional, i.e. homosexual families. And this is what the Supreme Court judge stated as they mandated that public primary schools would have to have books covering homosexual partnerships as legitimate. The judge declared that homosexuality, in their view of two dads, or brown dads, blue dads, there's a book about that. He said that's part of reality, and these books are portraying that reality. So here's a big issue. What is reality if it's not God defined? Reality in a postmodernist mind can be whatever any ethnic group with sexual orientation, ethnicity determines for themselves. So here's a judge pronouncing a postmodern view of law. Law should address the reality experienced by homosexuals, and their definitions of marriage are just as valid as anyone else. So that's how we ended up with same-sex marriage. Postmodernists redefined the term marriage based on his own postmodernist view of reality. And this particular school board here had 5,000 letters supporting its decision not to put the books in kindergarten grade 1 library, and 1,000 people wanted it, but the court ruled in favor of the teacher, who happened to be a homosexual, who sued the school board in order to put these books, force these books into public school libraries. What about the USA? Well, William's going to cover this, but the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, separation of church and state, says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So here we see a country like others, well, especially the USA, I should say, separating the church from the government to protect the church from the overreach of government, that government shall have no power to set up its own state religion or prevent anyone from practicing a religion. And another in Article 4, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So this was a very important foundation, unlike Islamic states today, where you have to be a Muslim if you want to get elected in any one of these Muslim countries. Christians that used to be elected in Indonesia have all been moved out now. So if you're going to run for government in Indonesia, you're going to have to be a Muslim. So in the United States, anybody can run, and there's no religious test. This is good insofar as it's majority Christian. However, with huge amounts of Islamic migration and immigration, there's a danger here, and we're going to see that happening where Islam is gaining a very growing stronghold in law and politics in the United States. We're going to look at Christian law briefly and then go to Islam. I just got a few principles here that really epitomize what we're on about as Christians: to bring life and society into conformity with the eternal principles of God. There is no secular realm. We have to remember this. This idea of a secular is a Greek idea. It's not biblical. In Acts 17, Paul demolished the Greek dualism by saying that there is a God who created the universe, the heavens. The Greeks were of the idea that the gods were subject to the eternal universe. And Paul said, no, I'm going to tell you who made the universe, and he came down and died on a cross. So that shattered Greek dualism, but we have rescued it. And we use the term secular, even though in the book, David Noble calls it secular humanism, but that's fine. Secular gives the impression that God is not welcome, that we as Christians are religious, and the atheist is not religious, he's secular, and so he should be allowed to make laws. We shouldn't because we're religious. And in fact, Americans, atheists, go insofar as say, well, you're religious and we want the separation of church and state, which means Christians can't be in government. Oh, well, that's interesting. So atheists really shouldn't be either, since they have a worldview, and certainly we shouldn't have any Muslims in government. So it's a ridiculous notion, but this has all come out of the view that certain parts of life are secular. They shouldn't have Christian involvement. And this is a big mistake. Psalm 24:1 says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. God is Lord over all the earth, and his law applies to everyone, everywhere. So for the Christian, law is a place of application for biblical principles that reflect God's definitions of justice, mercy, goodness, progress, etc. The Christian is concerned with promoting justice, and again, justice defined by God, not by Islam, and maintaining order. And again, order has to be defined by God, not by the Communist Party of China or the Venezuelan government or Cuba. What does order mean? How much freedom? How much responsibility do we have? We must certainly protect the innocent and judge or punish the guilty. So these are some general approaches. We haven't fleshed them out in any way. That's for our law professors and political science professors to do. And William's going to be doing some of that, I'm sure. But these are general ideas about how to create a society that protects and distributes justice and mercy and keeps order in a way that provides a protection for the innocent, but is clearly able to punish the guilty. I just want to shift a couple of principles to affirm that. Many of these came straight out of biblical references, like this one, 2 Corinthians 3:17, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So this can be worked out in the idea that no one is above the law. Deuteronomy 19:15 mentions the testimony of 2 or more witnesses, which again has been brought into the foundation of the West, such that we're entitled to a fair trial, and you can't be convicted without testimony, without having some evidence, and that requires witnesses. And this is a very powerful way to protect individuals from corrupt accusations, which happens all the time, by the way, in a place like Pakistan, which allows Muslims to simply claim, I heard Mary or this woman blaspheme the Quran, and then they're put in jail on the basis of no witnesses, just the testimony of one person who wants to get rid of Christians. So there's a law in Pakistan that's a death penalty to those who supposedly blaspheme the Quran. So people, Muslims who don't like their Christian neighbors, are able to simply say, I saw them do this, or I heard them say that, and there's no witnesses. So Islam has a different basis for crime and punishment than certainly Christianity does. And Christianity has been responsible for the modern concept of individual freedom, the right to express your opinion, the right to choose a career, buy and sell property, travel where you want, the right to own your personal space, to live your own life. Liberty and justice for all also means freedom of religion. It also means equal treatment under the law for women, minorities, and the poor. This is very significant compared to many countries in the world where certain political elites or judicial elites have way more rights and opportunities than anybody else. And, you know, that's not to be the case. Although we have to realize that justice is not cheap in the Western world, because if you're going to go to court in America or Canada and you're going to try and defend yourself against some large corporation, you might be bankrupt trying to defend yourself with the price of lawyers and counsel today. Anyway, Christians also endorse the idea there are natural laws because God created us to live in a universe with physical laws, but also moral laws, and therefore there are natural rights. Marxism, our other worldview, which is also atheistic, has proletariat law, the absolute rule of the Communist Party. So what you have in North Korea is a dictatorship of Kim Jong-un and the Communist Party. And you have these dictatorships everywhere that communism's taken root, and they're able to control the courts, and the courts enforce a communist view of history and the future and punish dissidents, people who don't agree with the state. So it's a system of injustice, really, to individuals, because whatever the Communist Party decides is going to become the law. Lenin said, the state is an organ of class domination, an organ of oppression of one class by another. So he said it pretty clearly, that you're going to have absolute rule by communist parties. And this also means the rule of the court system. Postmodernism, we've had a little bit of a look at, but again, law has no essential nature. There's no essential moral truth or reference point for it. And again, postmodernism is atheism. Law becomes a power struggle, especially as people are redefined as being victims. It's postmodernist law uses victimhood terms quite a bit and seeks to liberate people from so-called oppression, claims that it's going to speak for the dispossessed, and seeks to find these oppressed minorities like LGBTQ or people who are being persecuted because they're Islamic in the States, and so seeks to create liberation for oppressed victims. So law has a purpose to rectify injustices, especially focused on victims of past wrongs involving victims of race, ethnicity, or sexual preference or orientation. So postmodernist law is really focused on rectifying these so-called perceived injustices. In some cases there might be, but postmodernist law is not really going to be a solution that provides justice. There's no objective stance, but only a series of perspectives. So here's the key for postmodernists. If there's no objective truth other than what ethnicities and sexual communities and gender groups decide, then all you have is perspectives. There's no neutrality. As a Harvard Law School professor Martha Minow stated, there's no objective stance, but only a series of perspectives. No neutrality. No escape from choice in judging. So what do you do if you don't have a reference point for your decisions and you're on the US Supreme Court? Well, you're going to get some details of what postmodernists do when they make decisions on these courts. New spirituality has not focused a lot on law, justice, and judgment, not really some practical outworkings, because they're primarily concerned with self-development, self-law, than external. So there's not a lot of detail and hard work being done by people in new spirituality, other than they want to be free to do what they do, like the Hollywood types, to minimize the reach of the state, perhaps, in in their self search for truth. We are our own God, which really means a rejection of external standards. And people should follow their own bliss is another quote from a new spiritualist. Okay, I've got about 15 minutes, 15 to 20 before William comes on. I want to try and cover real quickly something about Islam. Islam has a lot to do with law. And I just want to pull a few slides out of a talk I'm probably going to give when we get to politics. But how do Muslims with Islamic law, how does it infiltrate our Western systems? We're going to look at political correctness and also legal action by groups like CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, which in many ways is a front for Islamic activism, judicial activism. We're going to see that Islam has a very specific strategy to shift Western nations away from any biblical basis or even secular humanist basis for law into an Islamic direction. There are a number of tactics and strategies I want to mention. I'll cover most of these, but if not, at least you'll have the tape. Taqiyya, we're going to see what that is. That's deception. Islamophobia is used by Muslims, claiming that anyone who's opposed to Islam is Islamophobic and we need laws to protect them. They want to set up a caliphate. We should be treated as dhimmis, and in many countries of the world, like Christians in Pakistan or even Indonesia, they're second-class citizens. Jihad has been termed legally defensible because the West is oppressing Muslims and need to be liberated. So 9/11 was a defensive action, a jihad action, which must be defensive. They also may use a victimhood mentality and claims that Muslims are being persecuted in the West, so we need to establish some Islamic law to make this injustice rectified. Okay, let's look at what very famous Sheikh Omar Bakri Muhammad, who lives in England, said. Jihadis will convert the West to Islam through ideological invasion. So we're going to see how this works out in law. Because remember, law represents a worldview, some sort of ideology. And so if the ideology or basis, being Judeo-Christian, is shifted, then shifted to what? Shifted to Islam, then you're going to redefine your terms in law. So let's look at this idea of taqiyya, which is used greatly in the West today. Politically, it means to simulate whatever status you need. In other words, to lie in order to win the war against the enemy. According to taqiyya, Muslims, and this is a quote from Muslims, it's not me. According to taqiyya, Muslims were granted the Sharia to infiltrate the Dar al-Harb. That means the war zone. Anywhere that Islam's not in the majority or not ruling is considered a war zone. They're there to infiltrate the enemy's cities and forums and plant the seeds of discord and sedition. These agents were acting on behalf of the Muslim authority at war and therefore were not considered as lying or denouncing the tenets of Islam. They were legitimate mujahideen whose mission was to undermine the enemy's resistance and level of mobilization. So this one last statement here. One of the major objectives, this is written by Muslims, was to cause a split among the enemy's camp. In many instances, they convinced their targeted audiences that jihad is not aimed at them. So taqiyya involves this. Lying is permissible if the goal is permissible, and obligatory if the goal is obligatory. This is a quote from Islamic law, Umdat al-Salik, certified by key Muslim Brotherhood entities and Fiqh Council of North America as Muslim Brotherhood doctrine. So lying and deception, telling Americans and Canadians that, you know, you're harmless, Sharia is perfectly good, whilst you take over and establish rights for yourself to silence anyone who criticizes Islam. So we have to be careful to understand how taqiyya works. Muslims target politics and law, which is what Christians should be doing more. So here is a statement. One factor that will act towards a better future for the Muslim community in the USA, this is written by Muslims, is to foster political figures. most Muslims in the US want to bring up their children as either a medical doctor or an engineer. There are no Muslim congressmen. Now, this is written by a Muslim. We have to direct Muslim youth since high school towards the study of law, but the mentality and culture of the immigrant Muslim community tend to put the study of medicine and engineering ahead of any other field. Youth have to be directed to the study of political science and law. And this was came out of Islam Online, and it referenced Allah Almighty said, and quoted At-Tabawa 9:46. Well, here we have the first Muslim congressman in the US, Keith Ellison, who often speaks at CARE fundraiser, even though the Council on American Islamic Relations has been indicted, has been recognized as contributing funds to overseas terrorist groups through various fronts in the US. Let's look at how law is used to bring Islam into Western nations like America. Let's call it lawful Islamism, the imposition of Islamist rules by nonviolent means. So lawful Islamists advance their cause through, one, lobbying politicians. So just think of how many Muslims you have in various states in the US lobbying politicians for things like Islamic schools, funding, access to courts, to have Sharia law implemented. We're going to see this. They often intimidate the media. Media rarely criticize Islam, but they certainly criticize Christianity. There's threatening international boycotts. You know, Saudi Arabia pushes its weight around by threatening to boycott Australian sheep if they don't set up Sharia slaughterhouses and don't conform. You know, there's a lot of economic manipulation by the Muslim world. They make predatory use of the legal system. They advance novel legislation, influence the contents of school textbooks, exploit the freedoms of an open society. So that's what lawful Islamism. It's not going to happen in America or Canada without sort of a democratic process, but they're targeting these and using our system of freedoms and openness, which was not built for Islam, by the way. And Muslims have more freedom here than probably the majority of any Muslim, well, all the Muslim countries in the world. And that's why many of them have fled these Muslim countries to come to the West, to get away from Sharia law in places like Iraq or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan. They also advance their agenda in incremental steps, leading to fundamental changes in society. So that's what Islam does. Let's have a couple of looks at this. Lawful Islamism is the imposition of Islamist rules by nonviolent means. Another quote, quietly, lawfully, peacefully, Islamists do their work through the West to, one, impose aspects of Islamic law, to win special privileges for themselves as Muslims, to shut down any criticism of Islam, to create Muslim-only zones, and to deprive women and non-Muslims of their full civil rights. So here's some of the ways that Islam is active in our Western nations to subvert our legal system. They also do legal action to silence or sue. The Council on American Islamic Relations loves to bring lawsuits against people or groups or states to silence any criticism of Islam when somebody writes an article stating that Islam does this or that. They simply disclaim that that is not Islam. You're generalizing, and they want to sue you for slander and hate crimes. We have a new punishment called a hate crime if you criticize Islam. But remember, Islam is a political ideology. It's not a race, so it's not racism to criticize Islam. It's a political ideology. It's a worldview, and it should be open to examination and criticism. I mean, if you want to go to university, I did a master's degree on Islamic political ideology. It wasn't illegal to do it. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of Islamic political journals that you can read. And so it should be fair opportunity for Christians to critique and criticize Islamic political activism anywhere in the world. But there's moves in law to silence any criticism of Islam, to force society to accept the sanitized version of Islam. Muhammad was a great reformer who established all these rights for women. Islam was beautiful and brought freedom to the world, blah, blah, blah. These are all revisionist history. They also seek to eliminate the will to resist the spread of Islam, because people go silent if they get sued, you know, by CARE in the United States. Who's got the money to fight the case? So people just go silent. It instills fear, and people don't want to say anything critical of Islam, so you just end up accepting it. In Britain, there are many Islamic Sharia courts now, which are legally binding. And this is where we see Islam getting into the courts, and it's happening in the United States as well. In 2008, Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, claimed publicly that formal recognition of Sharia law seemed unavoidable. What a concession for that man to make. And the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Phillips, gave his backing to the use of Islamic courts to deal with family, marital, and financial disputes. This is a Trojan horse, people. Now there are at least 85 decisions concerning marriages not recognized under English law. Polygamy and disputes regarding children are being made now by at least 85 Sharia courts in Britain. This is a subversion of the Western basis for law and the imposition of Islamic law under the umbrella of culture. And remember, Islam's not a culture any more than Christianity is a culture. There are Muslims from every part of the world. It's not a culture, it's not a race, it's a political ideology. And so we have to be very concerned if they are ever getting freedom to set up their own legal system. But these Muslim arbitration tribunal panels set up by lawyer Sheikh Faiz Al-Akhtab Siddiqui are now operating in London, Bradford, Manchester, Birmingham, Nuneaton, with more planned for Glasgow and Edinburgh. So it is the spread of a subversive ideology through law. Here is a poster I pulled out of an advertisement. It's back in 2008. This gives you the idea. Muslims are up front and telling you exactly what they want. Sharia law is the future for Britain. And they've got all of Britain colored green, which is the color for Islam, with a big Sharia flag in it. They're having talks, they're having conferences, they're bringing over speakers. This should not be allowed legally or politically any more than you're going to allow the Nazi party to set up a branch in California. I mean, there has to be limits and protection for the Constitution. Although you have freedom of religion, you must protect your court system and its bases, because it's not Islamic and you don't want it to become Islamic. However, Sharia law in court cases in 23 United States are now happening. The Center for Security Policy released an in-depth study, 2011, Sharia law in American state courts, an assessment of state appellate court cases. The study evaluates 50 appellate court cases from 23 states that involve conflicts between Sharia or Islamic law and American state law. The analysis finds that Sharia has been applied or formally recognized in state court decisions in conflict with the Constitution and state public policy. 23 states, and this is 2011, are experiencing the conflicts between Sharia law and US law. Here are some of the locations where these Sharia law have been used in states. 6 cases in New Jersey, 5 in California, 4 each in Florida, Massachusetts, 3 each in Maryland, Texas, Virginia, 2 each in Louisiana, Nebraska, and 1 each in these other states. So this is 2011. So we need to realize that law is making, or Islam is making, big inroads into law in our nations. This is from the Center for Security Policy. I like this man, Senior Counsel for the Thomas More Law Center, Robert Muiz, I guess that's how you say it. Thanks to the efforts of the Thomas More Law Center, a judge ruled the free speech rights of a Christian evangelist trumped the efforts of Dearborn, Michigan to, in effect, impose Sharia law's suppression of free speech. So basically what happened is Dearborn, Michigan is become a huge center of Islamic migration to the point where they basically control the city. I don't know if they've elected all the council, the mayor, which is what happens when you bring in huge numbers of migrants and you place them en masse in one area. So Dearborn, Michigan has become an Islamic center and political center, and Christians in some cases are being prevented by American police from going there to share their faith or talk to Muslims or even have an outreach. In other words, free speech has become limited where Muslims have become the majority. And this is happening in law, but thanks to this judge who upheld the idea that no, Americans should be free to go and talk to even Muslim Americans in Dearborn, Michigan about their faith and talk to them without being escorted out of town by the Michigan police. So we have to be careful that we don't see the police and courts enforcing the silencing of free speech in America, because Muslim Americans don't want anyone to talk to them about Jesus. So that's just one thing happening. I like this, and I want to end with this before we close for questions. Oklahoma has said no to Sharia law. And, it's not the only state. I think Tennessee and maybe a few others have decided at the legislative level, and this is where it has to happen, at the legislative level, that there will be no Sharia law used in this state to determine, or any case, that Sharia law has a different ideological, philosophical, and theological basis, and America cannot, or Canada or any country cannot allow a second state to operate parallel to the original state. You cannot have two separate law systems because they both have different bases, different definitions, different objectives, and one is certainly not going to promote the justice and the freedom of a just society like Christianity does. So we have to say no to Sharia law in any form, whether it's Canada or the US or anywhere. And this requires vigilance. This requires people to get involved, to fight for freedoms, or else the tide will just sweep in there and you'll have a law called Islamophobia, where you can't say anything to criticize Islam, because to criticize Islam is to criticize Muslims. Let me just say this in closing. I should be free to criticize Islam as a political scientist, because Islam is a political vision. There are journals, as I've said, dozens of political science journals written by Muslims. And I can talk about political Islam without talking about Muslims. And I make it very clear when I talk, I'm not talking about Muslims. It's not about racism or hate or anything like that. I'm talking about political Islam. And that should never be closed off to scrutiny and debate. Because to do so is to muzzle ourselves and to allow Islam to dominate our areas of speech and to silence us. And we are then captive under a worldview called Islam. Well, thank you. We're going to stop here and take some questions. And part 2 is going to have Professor William Wagner, who's going to share some aspects that he feels he's got on his heart right now. So I'm going to stop this.